Dear Victor, happy birthday to you. One more.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Big Show. Happy birthday to you.
This is my daughter, you know. She ate a lot of food here today. Now, please, a round of applause for them. Thank you very much.
Mommy.
Now, a very big music for them. Let us see them dance well. They are dancing like DJ. Give them that. Victor is going to cut the cake. Please, let's count 1 to 3. And Victor is going to cut the cake. I think Victor is playing for Arsenal. Is that Arsenal? Okay, he's playing for Nigeria Green Eagles. Now, 1, 2, 3 for Victor. 1, 2, 3. Round of applause for Victor, please. Clap for him. Wonderful. Now let's go to Victoria. Victoria, ready? Oh, she plays for Spice Girls. Is that Spice Girls? Okay, Spice Girls. 1, Victoria. 2, 2.5, 3. Please, a round of applause for Victoria. Oh, Teletubby is the last one. Oh, typical Teletubbies. Okay. Teletubby.
La.
Success. Come on, you don't have to be shy now.
That was success.
Success.
Okay, this is for success. Hold it. 1 for success. 2 for success. 2.5 for success. 3 for success. A round of applause of success now. Music for them. Thank you very much.
Mississippi putting it down. I'm the hottest round. Y'all can stop me now. Listen to me now. I'm lasting 20 rounds. And if you want me, then come on get me now. Since you with me now, that's biggie bounce. I love it. Switch my style. People sing around. Let's people gather round.
Says the cameraman. We are happy tomorrow morning. party has now started. Figure 8, where you did? The party continues. We are here till tomorrow morning.
ga-abịa ka unu bịa ihe pụta bịa ka unu bịa gba egwu ka unu sọpọtụ nwanne anyị nwaanyị wụ Liz biko.
gentlemen, very happy that all of you turned down. I'm quite happy. I thank you very much that you people came to support us with our children's birthday. May God bless all of you for coming. And the seed that the Lord have sowed in my house, may He sow it to one of you in Jesus' name.
Amen.
Those who is looking for husband, you will not go empty-handed. And those who is looking for children, you will not go empty-handed in Jesus' name. And I thank okay, those who is looking for wife, you will not go empty-handed in Jesus' name. And every mother, I thank God that you people have come to support us. And anytime you are doing something, invite us. My husband and I will come and support you in Jesus' name.
Amen.
Thank you very much. My Lord is good. My Lord is good. I will lift you higher. Anywhere I go, I will lift him higher. Lift him higher. Lift him higher. Daddy, Jesus is good. I will lift you higher, Daddy. Oh, anywhere I go, I will lift you higher. Thank you, Daddy Jesus.
Chineke indima o indima indima indima
Chineke idema o idema 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 Olúwa wa dára o dára o Chineke idema o Ladies and gentlemen, actually that was to tell you that you are just appreciated for this particular day. I think we are leaving by 11 o'clock if I'm right. 11 o'clock we have to clear up. Just finally, I would like to thank everybody for being here. May God bless you.
Thank you very much. God bless you all. Amen. God is good. God is back here. St. John's Community Hall. There's a party going on here tonight. You're welcome.
Bye. Oh,
For some, the Queen Mother is an enduring symbol of regal grace and feminine charm. Others, like Princess Diana, detected a more forceful character.
I think Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, is the original English steel magnolia. Perhaps we could translate it out of Southern States American. She's an English rose inside a steel spectacle case. You don't live until you're 99 unless you're tough.
I think she's got a core of steel. I think that she is a woman who is very conscious of what she's able to do. She is very feminine in some ways. She is almost a flirt, almost a tease, and I think she's been that all her life.
As Duchess of York, Queen Consort and Queen Mother, the former Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon has spent most of her adult life in royal duty. Ever gracious and always smiling, she's created a unique rapport with the public. Despite being as old as the century, she has refused to retire. What is the secret of her vivacity?
She actually enjoys life. She takes huge pleasure in relatively little things. She loves horse racing. She loves gardens. She obviously loves clothes. She's not unfashionable. She's not old-fashioned. She transcends fashion. Like another Queen Elizabeth, the greatest, the first. She's got a motto. The motto of Queen Elizabeth I was, if I dare use Latin, semper et adem, always the same. And I think, really, it could be the motto of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother.
When Elizabeth was born in 1900, Queen Victoria was the reigning monarch. The Queen died the following year. Edward VII took the throne with his beautiful Queen Alexandra. In 1910, their son became King George V. He was king during World War I. He changed the royal family's Germanic name, Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, to the House of Windsor. St Paul's, Waldenbury, was one of several houses of the Earl and Countess of Strathmore, the Bowes-Lyon family. It was the earliest home of their 9th child, Elizabeth Angela Marguerite. Their first daughter had died, and their new little girl, with her appealing looks and gentle manner, was especially adored.
She was very close to her mother, and I think perhaps she was a bit spoiled because she was a very charming child, and all the servants adored her. She used to go into the kitchen and beg for extra jellies and cream and things like that. I think because of her great charm, she could get away with anything.
Glamis Castle in Scotland, with its secret rooms and ancient ghosts, was another Strathmore home. Every summer, Elizabeth's family gathered here, holding shooting parties. They had afternoon tea in the Great Hall, a treat for Elizabeth and her younger brother David.
The Bowes-Lyons were a very old family, going back to God knows whom in Scotland, and they were also very rich. They'd come into money rather fortunately, as well as having a lot of land. And they owned several castles, a huge house in St James's Square in London.
Interestingly enough, they weren't terribly impressed by the royal family. Her father didn't really think much of the royal family. So at the time that there were thoughts that she might marry into the royal family, he wasn't especially impressed by that because they were really aristocrats in their own right and had come down. They were descended from King Bruce of the Scots and so on. So really very, very grand family.
World War I broke out in August 1914 on Elizabeth's 14th birthday. She helped to nurse wounded soldiers sent to recover at Glamis. Later, she wrote to one of them, "Dear Harding, thank you so much for your letter. I am sorry that you can't find a job. It seems to be very difficult now." Elizabeth became one of the most eligible girls of her time.
She was very petite and small, and she had a pretty heart-shaped face, and beautiful blue eyes, and a lovely complexion, and dark hair, which she wore in a rather old-fashioned way for those days with a fringe. But she had this sort of radiant attraction. She had this great power even then of making people feel that she was concentrating on them, that she was only interested in them, which is one of the most attractive qualities you can have.
King George V and Queen Mary were enchanted by Elizabeth. Their own children had been strictly brought up, creating personality problems. Bertie, their second son, was very shy. David, the Prince of Wales, was more rebellious. He met Elizabeth and liked her, but they never fell in love. Even then, he preferred more sophisticated women. It was Bertie who fell for Elizabeth's exceptional charms.
She was really the centre of masculine attention. A lot of men were in love with her. She was a great Deb in her day. When he met her, he fell in love with her absolutely instantly. And he was, with all his failings, because he was a very diffident, very shy, very reserved man, but he was always a very determined man. And once having fallen in love with her, he was determined to marry her. So he asked her 3 times, and for the first 2 occasions she refused. She didn't really want to be caught in this kind of royal cage. She was a woman who was used to her independence. She didn't really want to lead the restricted kind of life which marrying into the royal family would mean. But he was very persistent, the Duke of York, and he simply kept at her and kept at her and kept at her, and in the end she agreed.
She really loved him. He had a very vulnerable quality, which is very appealing to some women, and he did really need her. And then he was physically attractive. He had a very good figure, he danced very well, he was very athletic, he dressed very well, and he was a good guy.
On April the 26th, 1923, Elizabeth set out for her wedding at Westminster Abbey. It was the first royal wedding of the century. Elizabeth was now Her Royal Highness the Duchess of York. For over a decade, she would be the King and Queen's only daughter-in-law, adored by her husband and cherished by his family. The Yorks became the focus of public attention.
It was really a very popular marriage because the Prince of Wales, his brother, wasn't married at the time. So there was rather pressure really on the Duke of York to marry. So when they married, it was a great public occasion. The public were very taken with it because she was very, very beautiful. He was a good-looking man. It was a kind of romantic wedding, and very, very popular.
The Duke and Duchess were the rising stars of the new House of Windsor. Elizabeth, known as the Smiling Duchess, was her husband's mainstay.
She was so good for Bertie. She brought him out, she supported him, she made his life fun, she made everything go around him. And I suppose they must have been a bit worried because he'd had a history of bad health, because he stammered and was very shy. And so nobody could have been more ideal than she was for him.
Queen Mary formed a close bond with her son's wife, now the mother of Princess Elizabeth, born on April the 21st, 1926. The Duchess gave birth to a second daughter, Princess Margaret Rose. In August 1930, the King and Queen were delighted with the little princesses. Marriage transformed Bertie's life. Most of all, Elizabeth gave him the stability of a happy home and a precious family.
In private, they say that he was a man who could be quite easy, quite amusing, quite at ease with himself in private. But in public, he had none of this. She was exactly the opposite. She had all the strengths where he had the weaknesses. And as she wasn't in any way a domineering woman, she wasn't in any way a hard woman, she knew exactly how to handle him. She knew exactly how to bring out his strengths. So they were very, very good together. It was a very, very successful marriage. He said many years later when Queen Elizabeth, when his daughter Elizabeth married Prince Philip, he said, "Your mother is the most wonderful woman in the world." And I think this is perfectly true. They were a devoted couple.
Bertie referred to his family as us four. Their main role was to support his aging parents in their duties, especially in the absence of the Prince of Wales, who had other interests. David, the Prince of Wales, had drifted a long way from his highly moral family. So far, his affairs with married women had remained hidden from public view.
The Prince of Wales liked married women. He liked bossy women. He liked women who, in a way, could order him about.
He fell for an American divorcee, still married to her second husband. Mrs. Wallis Simpson was scorned by Elizabeth.
I don't think she approved of Mrs. Wallis Simpson at all. In fact, I don't think she ever really liked her. She was perfectly happy about some of the Prince of Wales's mistresses, like Thelma, Lady Furness, who was an American divorcee. She was perfectly happy with her. But there was something about Wallis that she didn't like, and I think she did not like the way that Wallis took over David's life entirely and separated him from his brothers.
While George V lived, the issue of David's love life was avoided, but at 70 the king's health was fading. On January the 20th, 1936, the king was dying.
Following bulletin was issued at 9:25. The king's life is moving peacefully towards its close.
George V's funeral was solemn and dignified. Britain said farewell to a much-respected monarch who had held firm in a war fought against his own cousin, the German Kaiser. The king's legacy of duty, above all else, fell to David, now King Edward VIII.
Our late sovereign lord, King George V, of blessed and glorious memory, that the high and mighty Prince Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David is now become our only lawful king by the grace of God of Great Britain, Ireland, and the British dominions beyond the seas, defender of the faith, Emperor of India. God save the King.
Elizabeth avoided the new king's mistress.
There was a story about one occasion when he had then become king. He was then King Edward VIII and gave a dinner party at Balmoral to which the Duke and Duchess of York, as they then were invited. And Wallis Simpson behaved like the hostess. She came forward to meet the Yorks to welcome them to Balmoral. And the Duchess of York had nothing to do with it. She simply walked past her and said, "I've come to have dinner with a king," and simply walked past Wallis Simpson, absolutely ignored her. Never liked her at all.
Outwardly, Edward VIII followed his father's traditions. He kept up the ceremonial side of his role, but he was a king in conflict with his government, church and family. His love for Wallis, now twice divorced, caused a constitutional crisis. After the Bishop of Norwich spoke out, the king abdicated.
You all know the reasons which have impelled me to renounce the throne. But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love.
Now in virtual exile, the former king married his mistress in France in June 1937. They were given the titles Duke and Duchess of Windsor, but Wallis was denied the prefix Her Royal Highness by the new monarch. This was the source of lasting animosity with Bertie and Elizabeth, now the king and queen, roles they had never expected.
From the start, when the Prince of Wales wasn't married and got older and older and still wasn't married, there was always a thought that her husband, that the Duke of York, might become king. So there was a thought in the back of her mind, but even so, it came as a great shock when actually when the abdication happened and they were called upon to be king and queen.
On December the 11th, 1936, Bertie chose the name King George VI to stress continuity with his deceased father and to distance himself from his abdicated brother. Elizabeth was ill in bed. She said, "I'm afraid there are going to be great changes in our lives. We must take what is coming to us and make the best of it." The coronation took place on the 12th of May, 1937. To the King and Queen, the ceremony was a sacrament. they vowed to God and their country a pledge of lifelong duty. Elizabeth sensed that a difficult time lay ahead.
She knew her husband very well. She knew his frailties. She knew that he was terribly shy, that he had in fact crowd phobia. He really didn't like that. And so she could see the enormous burden that would be placed on this not very strong man.
Foreign tours added the burden of international scrutiny, but the king knew that his wife's extraordinary charm would smooth the way. In June 1938, they were due to make a state visit to France when the Queen heard that her mother, the Countess of Strathmore, had died. With Europe on the brink of war, they knew the importance of cementing relations with France. The royal couple bravely continued their plans.
They decided not to cancel the tour, but it went ahead. And Norman Hartnell worked through all his reference books and thought, first of all, oh, we have to make everything in black. And then he decided, no, he found that white was a mourning colour for the royal family as well. So he made the entire wardrobe, everything was copied in white. She absolutely swept the press off their feet. The French adored her, and she looked so glamorous. It's probably the most striking royal tour that's ever happened anywhere.
The king changed. His wife and their family gave him the warmth and comfort he had not known as a child. The little princesses he adored grew up into attractive young women. Their mother was their role model. She was very close to her daughters, giving them both guidance and practical knowledge.
The family life of Elizabeth and Margaret, or was of course known as Mary Rose, seems to have been as near idyllic as it was possible to be. Their father was incredibly soft, tender, indulgent, particularly with the younger daughter, with Princess Margaret. Their mother, in many ways, seems to have been, by the standards of the 20s or 30s, almost more of a friend to them than either a formal mother, the Queen, our present Queen Elizabeth, and Princess Margaret. The one thing they can't blame their problems on is their own unhappy childhoods, because they weren't.
In 1937, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor upset the royal family and the British government by visiting Hitler in Germany. In June 1939, the King and Queen visited the White House and the US President Franklin Roosevelt. On this trip, they won a crucial ally for Britain. They also visited Canada, showing unity in the threat of war, which was only months away. The King had grown into his role, and the Queen had a genius for publicity. They had risen to the task, but the real test lay ahead. Meanwhile, in Cannes and other resorts on the Côte d'Azur, the show went on for the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, now regarded with suspicion.
They did think at the time that there might be something treasonable in them, because during the war, at the beginning of the war, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor they'd paid a visit to Nazi Germany, they'd been seen together with Hitler, and there was this theory that if Britain lost the war, that Hitler might put the Duke and Duchess of Windsor on the throne, and the royal family took this very, very seriously indeed.
Europe's social attractions were interrupted in 1940, when the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were sent to the Bahamas, where the Duke spent the war as governor. Queen Elizabeth regarded Wallis Simpson as unfit even to be a governor's wife, but at least they were out of the way. War brought separations. Men went to fight, and children were evacuated from the cities. Everyone looked to the royal family for morale and leadership. In 1940, Buckingham Palace suffered a direct hit. Queen Mary had been sent to Badminton, a safe house. Elizabeth wrote to her, My darling Mama, I hardly know how to begin to tell you of the horrible attack on Buckingham Palace this morning. Bertie and I arrived there at 11:15, and he and I went up to our poor windowless rooms. While the king believed that victory would come, the strain of the war took its toll on him. He was a heavy smoker.
I don't think she tried to stop him smoking very much, and I don't think she realised probably how bad it was for him. When it came to the drinking didn't affect his daily life, it didn't affect his work. He used to like a good hearty swig out of the whiskey decanter in the evening, particularly at regimental dinners. When it came to his fits of temper, she was one of the few people who could calm him.
Whenever he was in a temper, they say that she would teasingly take his pulse and go tick, 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 just to make him laugh at himself. He took himself very seriously. He took everything extremely seriously. She's got a more buoyant nature. She tends to throw things off. So they complement each other wonderfully well. Where he was short-tempered, she really was kind of as calm as the day was long. She's a very easy woman, I think, to live with, and this is exactly the kind of person he needed. He was a tremendous warrior. She was a woman who simply had a way of casting off her worries, a very equitable temperament.
The Queen set an example to the people in every area of public life. Hitler regarded her as the most dangerous woman in Europe.
He felt that she had the king, by then King George VI, under her thumb. He thought that she was, as indeed she was, a very strong-minded woman, and that her husband, King George VI, was a rather weak-minded man. And so Hitler was very conscious of the fact that she might have been the power behind the throne. Hitler was very conscious that she was a woman of considerable strength of character, which indeed she was.
Despite the dangers, the King and Queen refused to leave Britain. Like all their subjects, the King had a ration book, and the Queen had dress coupons, although she still set a style.
The royal family were just very, very careful not to appear as if they were ultra-privileged during the war. You know, they would adhere to all the rationings, conditions, you know, for petrol and all sorts of things.
Not for a moment did the Queen stop her personal war effort. Everywhere she went, people admired her warmth and sympathy. She even used the coded language of fashion to inspire.
Her outfit is is quite glamorous, and I think it's a touch of almost understanding that the detailing on top of the hat it looks like some design from an RAF insignia. And so you'd often get people on a different version wearing sweetheart badges, which looked like they had a wing of an aeroplane or something on it. She's done, you know, a bigger version of that. It's like, you know, it's like a moral support thing. Hats were one of the few things that weren't rationed during the war, so perhaps it was the type of thing that other people could say, well, at least I could perhaps, you know, aim to have a hat like that. People would make their own hats, or they would adapt old hats. So I think it was keeping her, letting people know that she still was in touch with what was happening to everyday people, and a very tiny little hat jauntily placed was quite, it looks cheeky. I don't know whether that was the intention, but it's quite fashionable. You know, small hats and big clumpy shoes were, you know, during the 40s, everybody was wearing them.
Bertie proved a remarkable king with the support of Elizabeth, who even arranged speech therapy to help him reduce his stammer. All her efforts as a wartime queen were rewarded when Nazi Germany surrendered to the Allies in 1945.
Hostilities will end officially at 1 minute after midnight tonight, Tuesday, the 8th of May. But in the interest of saving lives, the ceasefire began yesterday to be sounded along all the fronts. The German war is therefore at an end.
The King, Queen and their daughters appeared on the palace balcony with Prime Minister Winston Churchill to deafening cheers. In 1947, the royal family left Britain for the first time in 8 years. The 3-week cruise gave them time to relax and unwind after the ordeals of war. Princess Elizabeth would celebrate her 21st birthday away from home. As ever, the Queen kept smiling, but she knew that the King had lost weight and his health was already in decline. The 2-month tour ahead in South Africa, then a British Dominion, would prove very demanding for him. Everywhere they went, people greeted the royal family firm. As a young boy, Theo Aronson recalls one occasion.
We drove there through the heat and the dust one day to this terrible railway siding, not a blade of grass, not a tree, just this desolate country all around, and about 20 of us waited there for the train to come in. The King got out wearing an ordinary little summer suit, and the princesses got out just wearing ordinary little cotton or linen dresses. But the Queen dresses her for a garden party, tremendous ostrich feather hat and floating panels with ostrich feathers and pearls and jewels and high-heeled shoes, and quite right too. She had come 6,000 miles to be on that very spot on that very day. 32 years later, I met her and I told this little story. And I said the first time I'd seen you, I said, you stepped off that train and I thought you looked like $1 million. And she fell about, she laughed and laughed. She said, Mr. Aronson, we so seldom hear that kind of spontaneous remark. It makes all our efforts seem worthwhile.
On official occasions, all the family dressed up. Outshining stage and screen stars at premieres came effortlessly to Queen Elizabeth. This was the kind of event she always enjoyed. She loved mixing with theatrical people who found her enchanting with her easygoing manners and famous charm. While the world of entertainment celebrated its glamour icons, the Queen had her own signature style.
She was a fashion icon in the kind of way that people liked the fluff and the crinolines and the hats with the ostrich feather and the soft turquoise blue and the high heels, you know, with the sort of rather Minnie Mouse look. To say that she was a fashion icon like Jackie Kennedy would be, of course, not true.
Princess Elizabeth fell in love with the exiled and penniless Prince Philip of Greece, then a serving officer in the Royal Navy.
At the beginning, they weren't too eager, I think. They thought that, the present Queen was too young, really. She should really have met some other men. But the present Queen, I mean, their daughter Elizabeth was absolutely determined to marry Philip. And so, in the end, they liked him. He was a kind of man's man that King George VI liked.
Philip's uncle, Lord Louis Mountbatten, known as Dicky, was married to the heiress Edwina Ashley. The Queen thought them rather presumptuous.
She had certain reservations about his uncle Louis and his aunt Edwina Mountbatten. She thought that Dicky Mountbatten was pushy and ambitious and tried to get perhaps too much advantage out of Bertie, who was very fond of him. And she disapproved very much of Edwina, who she thought was a champagne socialist and rather fast.
On November the 20th, 1947, Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip were married in Westminster Abbey. It was a spectacular wedding which symbolised the end of an era of austerity for the nation and prompted fresh happiness for the royal family. The bride wore a fabulous embroidered gown, and the Queen lent her a royal heirloom.
There is a strong tradition for a bride to wear something borrowed on her wedding day. And for Princess Elizabeth's wedding, she was lent a fabulous diamond sunray fringe tiara that was originally set with diamonds in 1830. It's a Hanoverian tiara. And that was handed down to Queen Victoria and through the royal family. It's very bridal. It does frame the face beautifully and is a very fitting ornament to a wedding day.
The Queen knew that the family firm of us four must now include Philip. At 47, she knew she would never have a son of her own. Princess Elizabeth would succeed the king as monarch. Queen Mary knew that thanks to Bertie and Elizabeth, the monarchy was secure. In 1948, they celebrated their silver wedding anniversary. The king, only 53 and already suffering the early symptoms of his final illness, bravely made a speech.
It has been made the occasion of a worldwide expression of kindly goodwill towards us, which has greatly moved us. It has been an unforgettable experience to realize how many thousands of people there are in this world who wish to join in the thankfulness we feel for the 25 years of supremely so happy married life which have been granted to us.
In November 1948, Princess Elizabeth gave birth to her first child, Prince Charles. Now a grandmother, Queen Elizabeth had a new and important role. She doted on the little boy. 2 years later, his sister, Princess Anne, was born. As this new era began, another was soon to end. On January the 31st, 1952, Princess Elizabeth flew to Kenya on behalf of her sick father. She would never see him again. The king died in his sleep at Sandringham just 6 days later.
This is London. It is with the greatest sorrow that we make the following announcement. It was announced from Sandringham at 10:45 today, February the 6th, 1952, that the king, who retired to rest last night in his usual health, passed peacefully away in his sleep earlier this morning.
Among those in the funeral procession was the Duke of Windsor, honouring the brother who had taken on the heavy burden of duty in his place. The Duchess was not invited. The Queen Mother, as Queen Elizabeth now became known, blamed the Duchess and most of all the Duke of Windsor for the King's early death.
I think she certainly believed that the Duke of Windsor, by his irresponsibility in abdicating and leaving the throne to George VI, had shortened her husband's life. She absolutely, seriously believed this. And there's a certain element of truth in it. Because of the strain he went through, particularly during the war, when he was informed by Churchill of exactly what was happening, I think this worry and the excessive smoking, this kind of thing, did shorten his life.
He was a tremendous warrior and borne down by the whole responsibility of being king. I'm absolutely sure it shortened his life. Yes, it was. For a man of his nature, who had the stammer, who was very shy, it was a tremendous responsibility. And although she did absolutely everything to ease his path, I'm absolutely sure that being king shortened his life. And she knew this, I think, always bore a grudge against the then Duke and Duchess of Windsor because they had shortened the life of her husband.
On June the 2nd, 1953, the world witnessed her eldest daughter crowned Queen Elizabeth II. It was the first televised coronation. The Queen Mother guided her 4-year-old grandson Charles throughout the long service. Much was expected of the young queen, only 26 at her coronation. She would need the experience and support of her mother. Family unity, so much on display that day, would soon be tested. By the time of the 1947 voyage to South Africa, Princess Margaret was falling in love with her father's equerry, Group Captain Peter Townsend, a married man. After the King's death, Townsend divorced his wife. Working for the Queen Mother at her new home, Clarence House, he was now closely involved with Margaret.
It all came as a great surprise to the royal family, really, because it had been I mean, a secret love affair between Princess Margaret and Peter Townsend. And the Queen Mother really had no idea at the beginning that this was going on under her very nose, because they were all together there in Clarence House. He was the controller, the Queen Mother's controller in Clarence House. So it came as a complete surprise. And what the Queen Mother did, which she does on many occasions, is simply turn her back on the whole thing. She simply put it out of her mind.
The Queen Mother has always had her eye on history and has always wanted it to be known that she is above reproach. And to have involved herself in a scandal, which it was at that time, which was likely to bring down the royal family, or at least certainly severely damage the royal family if Margaret had married Townsend, I think she wanted to stay as clear from it as possible.
Princess Margaret was determined, really, to marry Peter Townsend at an early stage. She felt it just wasn't right for all sorts of reasons, and in the end, of course, they prevailed upon Princess Margaret, and she gave him up.
Her sister, the Queen, didn't put any pressure on her at all. Princess Margaret's actual own Christian faith, and I think sense of her royal position, were the factors that decided her. I don't think she wanted to become a housewife, and Townsend would never have had any money.
The Queen Mother was overjoyed when Margaret, then almost 30, fell in love with society photographer Anthony Armstrong Jones. Their engagement was announced in February 1960, and the wedding took place on May the 6th. The bridegroom was created Earl of Snowdon. They had 2 children, David and Sarah, but the Snowdons would divorce 18 years later. However, the Queen Mother retained her affection for her son-in-law.
The Queen Mother always adored him. And because he was fun, because he was artistic. She likes people with taste. And so much did she like him that when things were going badly, and I think after they were even divorced, Princess Margaret used to get quite cross because her mother went on entertaining Anthony Armstrong Jones as though nothing had happened.
The Duke and Duchess of Windsor often travelled to New York, but they made their permanent home in Paris. Here they entertained on a grand scale. They sold their memoirs and were sometimes interviewed. The Duchess never forgot her husband's royal status.
I remember coming back from China. It was after the prince's trip to America. And there was this song then saying, I knew a girl who danced with the Prince of Wales.
He died in May 1972, aged 77. In death, he returned to the royal family. He was buried in royal ground at Frogmore near Windsor Castle, according to his wishes. But nothing could reverse the fact that he had been estranged from his family. Only 18 months had separated him in age from his younger brother. But he outlived Bertie by 20 years. Some blame the Queen Mother for the long rift between the royal brothers.
I think she certainly had a certain amount of influence in keeping the Duke of Windsor out of England. She mistakenly believed that he was still, would attract people and would make her husband less popular than he was, in comparison seemingly dull and this sort of thing. I think she miscalculated.
Prince Charles was the Queen Mother's favourite, although she adored all 6 of her grandchildren. He became the son she never had. It was to her that he always turned for love and affection, particularly when he was sent away to boarding school in Scotland.
He was at school at Gordonston, which he detested. He was terribly lonely, he was bullied, he was absolutely miserable. And he would go and stay with her at Birk Hall, and she would encourage him and encourage his taste in music and generally cherish him. And I think she saw in him the same sort of vulnerability that her husband had had, and they were very close.
He was a great favourite with her, and I think she encouraged him in many ways that his parents didn't. They were rather conventional. The Queen and Prince Philip had very conventional tastes on what young men should be. The Queen Mother appreciated his softer, more artistic side, and I think she certainly encouraged him as a young man.
Many of Charles's attitudes and interests spring from his grandmother. She even approved his choice of bride. She knew Lady Diana Spencer through her family's aristocratic connections. Diana had grown up in her father's care, but no one knew how much her parents' divorce had affected her. Diana's mother had lost custody of her children through the testimony of her own mother, Lady Fermoy, a longtime friend and lady-in-waiting to the Queen Mother. Any misgivings which she may have had about her granddaughter's suitability as a bride for Prince Charles were kept to herself. Duty to the royal family meant more than anything else to Lady Ruth Fermoy. The marriage was quietly promoted by the Queen Mother.
I do know that the Queen Mother said to Prince Charles, well, you know, you're not to mess her about. And if you don't grab her, somebody else will, because she's so attractive. She certainly said that. But I rather was told, but again, how far you can believe people, that, that Lady Fermoy really didn't think it was a good idea. But there again, you see, you have to understand how courtiers are. They don't tell the boss anything the boss might not want to hear. So, however much she may have said afterwards, oh God, I don't think she went along and said to the royal family, listen, I'm not sure this is going to be a good idea. I'm sure she didn't.
True to form, Ruth Fermoy supported Charles against Diana. The Queen Mother's presence at Lady Fermoy's funeral in 1993 was the final honour for the courtier who had put royalty before her own family, but had let down both her daughter and granddaughter. Perhaps influenced by Lady Fermoy, the Queen Mother came to see Diana as frivolous with little sense of duty. Diana considered the Queen Mother as a source of negative comment.
I don't think that there was much of a relationship there between the Queen Mother and the Princess of Wales. And of course, as things started to go wrong, the Queen Mother was ferociously loyal to Charles, always took his side.
Diana and the Queen Mother often had to meet in public. On these occasions, they had to hide the suspicion and growing coolness between them.
Diana decided to do her own thing. The Queen Mother could never really work out how Diana could do it and get away with it. And of course, the more Diana did and the more Diana got away with it, the bigger the breach between the two of them. And it was never going to be resolved. And in the end, it's my belief that Diana absolutely hated the Queen Mother. Perhaps unfairly, perhaps unfortunately, but it's true that that was the case.
Balmoral was used to conceal Charles's affair with another woman. At Birkhall, the Queen Mother's house on the Scottish royal estate, he frequently met Camilla Parker Bowles.
The Queen Mother had a number of close friends, most of them courtiers, but occasionally people who were outside the royal court. And possibly the closest of all those was Derek Parker Bowles, whose son Andrew finally married Camilla Parker Bowles. And I think that the Queen Mother, from the outset, because of her close friendship with that family, saw that one of us was having a relationship with the Prince of Wales. When it came down to it, when Prince Charles needed somewhere to go with Camilla, Birkhall, the Queen Mother's house at Balmoral, was made available, always with her knowledge, because Prince Charles is a dutiful grandson. He knows everything about keeping in touch with the Queen Mother, letting her know what's going on, and has always dedicated himself to that idea. And in return, the Queen Mother, rather enjoying the secret nature of this relationship between Charles and the adulteress, Mrs. Parker Bowles, was quite prepared to smile on it and lend her house to them.
Princess Margaret has a different relationship with her mother than the Queen. As the more difficult daughter, Margaret has often needed her mother with her constant example of gaiety and social ease. No event has ever challenged the Queen Mother, not even meeting the Beatles, for whom she wore her finest jewels.
Queen Mother's principal trademark is her love of pearls. She was a 1920s bride. She was brought up in that era when pearls were the most important accessory for a young girl, and for any ladies of style and society. And she's remained true to that wonderful formal and traditional look. She still wears the most exquisite strands of pearls.
The Queen Mother is an expert at image and presentation. No appearance is achieved without considerable attention to detail by her designers.
Touching here, something wrong with the shoulder line. Here, the neckline, and then the fitter will suggest, perhaps, Mum, if we alter that, we make the neckline a little higher, would you feel? Yes, I think that would be very nice. And touching the hat here, it's got to come up. And we all the little bits and pieces and the little band that goes underneath, you don't get complaints, but you know that if it isn't, you just keep on doing it until it's right.
The Queen Mother's father, the Earl of Strathmore, inherited £250,000. He was a multi-millionaire by today's standards. Once a rich woman with a royal fortune, she is now reported to be heavily in debt.
Well, she's inherited some money from her father, but much more so from her husband, King George VI, who died back in 1952. And at that time, the Queen Mother was considered a very wealthy woman in her own right. But since then, her lifestyle has been very, very extravagant, and that's really, it seems, eaten into her fortune. 5 years ago, the Queen Mother put £19 million in trust for mostly her great-grandchildren. And a good deal of that is to go to Princes William and Harry in 2 instalments, 4.9